Everything you feed will grow. I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere else to go. Please don't stomp your feet on my soul. I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere else to go. Please don't make me cry. Please don't let me die. Please don't stop the music. Please don't let me go. Let's go back and cuddle. Let's go back and grow. Let's go back and feed it. Let's go back and everything you feel will grow. I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere else to go. I'm gonna stay here. I'm gonna stay fair. I'm gonna stay peace. I'm gonna stay love. I'm gonna stay here. I'm gonna stay fair. I'm gonna stay peace. I'm gonna stay love. No more, no more. No more war, no more. No more war, no more war. No more war, no more. No more war, no more. No more war, no more. No more war, no more war. No more war, no more. I wanna see you close to me. I wanna feel you in my dreams. I wanna have you in my reality. I wanna flores em meu jardim. Eu quero luas e a mídia, Califórnias e orquídeas. 'Cause everything you feel will grow. Everything you feel will grow. I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere else to go. Everything you feel will grow. I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere else to go. I'm gonna stay here. I'm gonna stay fair. I'm gonna stay peace. I'm gonna stay love. I'm gonna stay here. I'm gonna stay fair. I'm gonna stay peace. I'm gonna stay love. Please don't make me cry. Please don't let me die. Please don't stop the music. Please don't let me go. Let's go back.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rahel Kamal. I'm the membership coordinator with Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, and I will be moderating and hosting. PSR-LA is hosting this webinar, A Just Transition, Envisioning the Next 40 Years. Thank you all for joining us for this really important conversation. So PSR-LA launched the Health and Justice webinar series to honor our 40th year anniversary in November. We aimed to dig deeper into the issues that impact our communities by bringing together experts to discuss in a meaningful dialogue. Through discussion and building our scope of knowledge around intersectional social justice issues, we believe that we will be ready to take the necessary action to combat systems that threaten our health and safety. Today, we are joined by some of the most inspirational and dedicated people in this fight for a better world. This discussion will require all of us to deeply think about the world that we want to see in the next 40 years. So before we start, I want to ask you all to think about this question. What would you want your community to look like in the next 40 years? In terms of physical and social infrastructure, what social or physical infrastructure would you change? And what can you do and what could we all do collectively to bring this into reality? So feel free to chat it in as you're thinking about this throughout the webinar. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And we're gonna explore these questions with our panelists and speakers. And now it is my honor to introduce our special guests and our panelists. We're joined by PSR-LA's Executive Director, Martha Dina Arguello. Martha joined PSR-LA in 1998 to launch the environmental health programs and became Executive Director in November 2007. Martha is an active board member of numerous organizations, including Californians for Pesticide Reform, the California Environmental Rights Alliance, and the Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy. She also co-founded the Los Angeles County Asthma Coalition and the Coalition for Environmental Health and Justice, and was appointed to Cal EPA's Environmental Justice Committee and the California Air Resources Board Global Warming Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. And for the past 35 years, Martha has served in the nonprofit sector as an advocate, community organizer, and coalition builder. We are also joined by PSR-LA Associate Director, Denise Duffield. Denise directs PSR-LA's Nuclear Threats Program, which advocates for health protective policies related to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. Denise leads PSR-LA's participation in the National Back from the Brink campaign, which brings local communities together to build the public support and political will needed to fundamentally change US nuclear weapons policy. Denise also works on environmental health and justice issues, addressing the needs of local communities who are impacted by toxic and nuclear contamination and the failure of regulatory agencies to protect them. Denise serves on the board of the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, a national network of organizations that work to address issues of nuclear weapons protection, production, and waste cleanup. And last but not least, I would like to introduce our special guest of the evening, Gopal Dayaneni. Gopal has been involved in fighting for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice through organizing and campaigning, teaching, writing, speaking, and direct action since the late 1980s. Gopal is the co-founder of Movement Generation, Justice, and Ecology Project. And currently, Gopal supports movement building through his work with organizations including the Climate Justice Alliance, ETC Group, and the Center for Story-Based Strategy. And Gopal works at the intersection of ecology, economy, and empire. I want to thank all of our panelists and speakers for joining us. To start us off, Gopal Dayaneni will begin by framing the conversation through the lens of Movement Generation's Just Transition framework. So I'd like to invite Gopal to the stage at this time.
Classic move there, I was on mute. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. And Martha, I really appreciate every opportunity we get to do things together over the many, many years, and just much appreciation to PSR-LA and the work that you all do, and all the folks out there who support and are members of Physicians for Social Responsibility LA. And thank you for having me. So I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation and framing some of Movement Generation's sort of curriculum and framework to get us started. And you know, my experience of this is that I'm not going to say anything anybody doesn't know, but hopefully it will say it or share it in a way that that says, oh, that that really speaks to how I understand the moment or the movement, and how I want to engage with this. And hopefully it'll help us frame what I'm really excited about, which is a conversation with Denise and Martha as we move forward. So I am going to share my screen. And right now it is. I'm one of those people who's at the stage in my life where I have to talk through every time I click a button. You know, it's like, okay, now I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everybody can see. Is it say eco? Okay, great. And my students always make fun of me because I'm always like, okay, now I'm going to press the button here. So I want to start with movement generation. We're the Justice and Ecology Project, and we talk about ecology and economy and ecosystems, and it all starts with this little word eco. And I often when we ask people, it's like, what does eco mean? And some folks might know, but a lot of times people think it means like Earth or planet or environment. But actually, eco comes from the Greek oikos, and it just means home. And eco means home. And we like to really start there because for us, everything is grounded and must be grounded in our relationship to home. Which brings us to the first word I want to walk through, and I'm going to go through these really fast. But if eco means home, what's an ecosystem? Well, I think people often think of an ecosystem as like, all of the things in an environment, like a catalog of all of the living and non-living things in an environment. But that's actually not what an ecosystem is. System actually also comes from the Greek, and it means relationship or togetherness. And an ecosystem is actually the relationships of home. It's not a catalog of all the things that are in a place. It's actually the complex of relationships. And what's important about that is looking at and studying and thinking about ecosystems is really about thinking about relationships and centering relationships as opposed to centering things and objects in their isolation and separate from each other, which for us is like the really important grounding thing. And I think that's something that's really important in grounding about health, that it's fundamentally not something that you possess. We're learning that now in the pandemic. Health is actually something that is shared. It is a relationship we have, and it is a relationship we have to each other and to the living world around us. So if eco means home and ecosystem is the relationships of home, then what's economy? Well, economy is actually just the, I'm sorry, my little mouse disappeared, is the stewardship or care or management of home. The nomi just means the management of home. And it doesn't mean stocks and bonds and buying and selling and jobs. It doesn't mean GDP. It doesn't require growth. It doesn't mean capitalism. It simply means the management of home. And for all of time, there have been so many diverse ways in which we have cared for the relationships of home and our place in them, and an incredible diversity of ways that we've done that based on the living systems upon which we depend. And it's only been in this tiny little fraction of a time that we've suddenly decided to put the word "the" in front of economy and separate ourselves from it and measure it by things like gross domestic product or whether the stock market is up or down, right? Like some of us remember when, like economy meant thrift, and it's this idea that we can, and we all do participate in many, many different kinds of economies all at the same time, right? It's like, if you've ever, dropped what you were doing to go pick up your friend's kids or cooked food for someone who was sick, you are participating in the management of your relationships of home, even if it's not valued in the dominant extractive economy. And the question is, what kind of economy do we want to live in? And what kind of economy do we want to create? Which gets us to a really important principle I want to share, which is all economies are nested within ecosystems. All economies have an ecological basis. And we are nested in economies, which means we can only experience the world around us through the economy in which we are embedded, which is why I say there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Because a 5.0 earthquake in California will wake me up in the middle of the night, shake my home, maybe break a few dishes, but a 5.0 earthquake in Bangladesh can collapse a sweatshop and kill thousands of people. And we're experiencing that right now in Haiti. It's not a natural disaster because we will only ever experience it as it's mediated by the economy in which we are in. And an inequitable economy will inequitably distribute the consequences. And it doesn't matter if it's an earthquake or a pandemic or climate disruption. And so if we want to navigate the world together, we must build an economy that does that for us, that helps us create that kind of shared relationship to the consequences, both positive and negative. And we see that, of course, even with healthcare. So one principle that I want to uplift here is that what you do to the land, you do to the people, and what you do to the people, you do to the land. And that is because our relationships to each other are ecological relationships. Social inequity is a form of ecological erosion and will inherently result in, social inequity is a form of ecological imbalance that will inherently result in ecological erosion. That means inequity in our relationships creates an imbalance in healthy ecosystems that then creates further degradation, which creates further imbalance in our relationships, right? Because if you have to have disposable land for mining, you have to have disposable communities. As my friend Hop Hopkins wrote in an excellent piece last year called Racism is Killing the Planet. This is recognition that our relationship to each other and our relationship to living systems cannot be separated out. I use this picture, since it's PSR-LA, I thought it might point out that this is a picture of the LA River. And a lot of people don't even know there's an actual river. But that's an interesting reality in Los Angeles, right? You have the highest density of freeways inside a city limit anywhere in the world. You have the highest density of oil infrastructure inside the city limit anywhere in the world. It's the largest prison population of a city anywhere in the world. And you entombed your living river in concrete, right? The colonization of the land and of the people and of the river led to a cascading failure of imagination, of thinking, of design, of city. I think it's deeply related. You entomb the river in concrete and you put the people in cages. Not you meaning LA. I mean, that's what we do when we don't think through our relationships. Ecology, I think most people know that. That's your knowledge or study of home. I'm going to just bring us to the end here. And I think of ecological as this notion of like the applied knowledge of home, because, if ecology is knowledge of home or study of home, ecological is like our thinking about home. And I want to bring this to Movement Generation's purpose, which is this idea that we believe in ecological justice. So what is ecological justice? It is the applied knowledge of home towards justice. And what is justice? Justice is what love looks like in public, as Cornel West so eloquently says it. And I just love that quote. And recently, someone said, well, if justice is what love looks like in public, what's love? And that led us to really lift up another great inspiration for us, Bell Hooks. And Bell Hooks talks of love as a combination of 6 ingredients: care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and truth. And that idea that we bring that kind of love into the public sphere towards all of our relationships, social and ecological. So with that, I want to say do two quick things. And I know I'm probably like eating up time here, but hopefully I'm doing okay. Good news is the extractive economy that we are embedded in has an inevitable end. That's not really a positive thing. I'm not a big fan of collapse. I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, it's coming to an end, yay, because it's, you know, this economy, it sucks to be poor in this economy when it's working well. Imagine what it will be like during collapse. Like, we actually have to take responsibility for a transition here. But there is a reality, which is you cannot extract from a finite system faster than its capacity to regenerate and get away with it. You cannot dig, burn, and dump the living world, and you cannot exploit the labor of the living world faster than its capacity to regenerate and get away with it. There's a really, really good book on the subject that everybody should read that I think is probably one of the best articulations of this concept. It's called The Lorax by Dr. Seuss, right? Because if your economy is based on selling needs and you chop down the truffula trees faster than they can grow back, your economy will collapse. And it doesn't matter how much wealth you accumulate in that process. And you may be able to insulate yourself while the brown barbaloots flee and the swimmy swans get crummies in their tummies. But eventually your economy will collapse. It's just a simple fact of finite systems. So with all of that, it led us at Movement Generation, along with movement allies from the Climate Justice Alliance and a whole host of environmental justice and racial justice organizers who are really centrally concerned with this question of economy, to say, how do we navigate this? What do we need to do? And so we developed this way of talking about it called the Just Transition Framework. And I want to just share a little bit about this because I think it really connects with the conversation we're going to have today. I have a hard time imagining what a 40-year vision looks like because the material conditions are changing so fast every day. And but what I can imagine is what we as organizers, as people concerned with justice, can and should be doing on the path towards that. So this, I'm not going to go through all of this in enormous detail because everybody can, like, there's a little booklet about it that we put together. But I want to just say that we find ourselves in an economy of extractivism, and it has some very basic elements, which is basically the purpose of the economy is the enclosure of wealth and the enclosure of power. And what's interesting about systems is that the purpose of a system is only ever observed. You observe what a system does, and that's what it does. And if you don't like that purpose, you have to intervene in the system to serve a different purpose. So we observe this mass, this rapid, intense enclosure and ever escalating enclosure of resources of wealth, and of course, concentration of power. And it can only happen by digging, burning, and dumping up the living world and exploiting human labor at unprecedented, scales and over long periods of time, beginning with colonialism and enslavement and going back even further. And it has a culture and cosmology that keeps it in place that includes white supremacy and patriarchy and individualism and the idea that we have to buy happy to be happy. But what I think is really also important is that the foundation of its governance must be systematic, well-organized violence, because all enclosures are ultimately maintained through violence. Doesn't matter whether it's the border around the nation state or the fence around your house that requires the cops to enforce its legitimacy. All enclosures are ultimately enforced through violence, and all frontiers of new resources are ultimately claimed with violence. which is, I think, a really important part of our conversation today, which is the relationship between energy and militarism, between nuclear power and nuclear energy. And when I say nuclear power, I mean military power. And when we say nuclear power, we mean the energy power. Both require disposable land, disposable people, disposable resources, and neither can help us navigate the crisis that we're in. And then the vision for us is like, we need a whole new purpose. And for us, that purpose needs to be social and ecological well-being, which I think is best described as health. And I often say, and Martha and I've talked about this before, I hate the notion of the climate crisis. Because when you think of the climate crisis, you think of looking up at the atmosphere and counting carbon, instead of looking down at the economy, at the exploitation of land, labor, and living systems, and the erosion of seed and of soil and of story and of our spirits. But health is a frame that helps us see it all together. You can have a healthy child, a healthy ecosystem, a healthy family, a healthy community. You can even reimagine healthy economy, not simply being, the stock market going up, but actually people's needs being met. What is a health-based economy? And now we see health and even health provision as a common pool resource, something we all share and that requires our interdependence. That it's not about me not getting sick. It's about me making sure other people are safe as well. So I think there's something really powerful about that notion of health as a frame for rethinking health and care and well-being as the way we think about a different kind of world. I've probably gone way too long already, so I'm going to stop. But I want to just bring it back to some of the bridge of our conversation today. We're going to connect climate and some of the false solutions, and particularly nuclear power and militarism and their relationships. And Denise was wonderful to share some of these slides. So I wanted to give you an opportunity. I just really appreciated the way you made the connections between nuclear war and nuclear power. And so I just wanted to give you the opportunity to share some of these slides and tell us some of these stories as we bridge to our conversation. And thank you so much for letting me ramble on.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gopal. That was so powerful. You said many things that touched on, everything that we hope to discuss and go a little bit deeper. Before I pose the first question, I want to ask Martha and Denise, what does this bring up for you? What do you think about after hearing Gopal's presentation and this framework that Gopal has set up for this discussion?
Well, I think the first time, I've worked with Movement Generation, we've done some just transition training, and every time I think it helps reframe and refocus our work. And we have often, based on that relationship over the years, I've asked, what is the health professional's role in an organization like ours in this conversation about what a just transition looks like, and what would happen if we had an economy and a system that actually centered on creating wellness versus profits and stock markets, right? So and it's also shaped some of our work where we're good at fighting the bad, right? The environmental justice movement, that's how we were born, out of fighting the bad things that were going to get dumped in our communities. And now that movement is growing and surging with these bottom-up solutions that get us to wellness. So I think it's exciting, and I'm excited to figure out how we build movement, because to do this we need a broad movement. How do we create movement within the environmental justice community and the anti-nuclear movement? Because we need that movement for resilience, and in the 40 years, whatever happens, we're going to need that critical connection to each other and to our movement, so we understand the false solutions that are being supported. And then And I'll stop and I'll hand it over to Denise because I'm actually really excited to hear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Rahel asked me, what did this bring up? And I'm like, my mind is going to explode. So many exciting connections, particularly in the work with nuclear weapons abolition. It's so often siloed, which is also a terrible word to use in relation to nukes, from the environmental health and justice movement. And I'm hoping that some of the conversations that we're having today within our organization will sort of be the beginning of a more than just solidarity work, but pulling way back into the big picture and what kind of world we want to live in. What is a just economy, and how does that not just impact our relationships with each other as activists. The image that Gopal had up there was the image of the Trinity nuclear test site, talking about what we do to the land, we do to people, what we do to people, we do to the land. When you look at some of these images, they're pretty frightening. And in this particular case, the first people to be exposed to a nuclear blast were right here in the United States, and have continued to suffer health impacts and have throughout generations, yet still aren't included in government compensation plans that other test downwinders are. So it sort of brings together both the health, the justice, the environment, and where we are today. These are not past harms; they are harms that continue into today. And so we're talking about militarism, but with nuclear weapons, it's a willingness to blow up the world and ourselves simply to dominate others, to get other non-nuclear states to submit. And we can't, as a species, survive when, and literally, it sounds cliche, but the push of a button, we're gone, and we then become suicide bombers because we are all connected, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a nuclear accident or whether it's climate change. It's nothing stays in one spot. What we do to the land and we do to people, we are also doing to ourselves, and that is crazy. So those are just some of the sort of immediate takeaways I have, that also just this idea that a nuclear option has come to mean just the thing we do to make a problem go away, the big thing, and that we shouldn't have nuclear options in a restorative, in a caring and a loving, justice-based economy.
Yeah, and that leads perfectly to the first question of just doing something because of this climate crisis panic that we, due to like the recent reports that are coming out, specifically the IPCC report, or the the floods and the fires, it's all leading people to feel panicked. And sometimes folks are feeling that anything really is better than nothing, or to change the trajectory of where our planet is headed. But Gopal, I wanted to ask you, how do we fight that urge to panic instead, and rather instead take the time to truly understand a just and equitable solution that may take some time, but ultimately it will lead to a world that sustains life?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And so I find this is like kind of one of the things that I find most challenging in the moment that we're in, which is this sort of politics of desperation. Where the urgency is real. There's no question that the urgency is real. But the problem is when urgency enables desperation and desperation enables false solutions. It's the challenge is the urgency is being used to justify things like, for example, that nuclear power is somehow clean, and it's only somehow clean if all you're doing is counting atmospheric concentrations of CO2. But if you're actually counting, and even then, there's a question about whether you would even call it clean. But if you're actually looking at the impacts on human communities, on ecosystems, on populations, and on people, you realize it's not. And I would argue that the urgency is so real that we cannot afford to do anything but that which will actually address the problem. And that means actually restoring land and ecosystems, putting people back in control of their labor, right? Because it is not, it's not the extraction of fossil carbon that created the climate crisis. It's the exploitation of human labor and the labor of the living world that then is wielded like a chainsaw against the rest of nature, that then extracts the fossil carbon that then screws up the atmosphere. And so it's actually like the path is very, very clear. It's food sovereignty, it's energy democracy, it's indigenous sovereignty, it's the restoration of land and labor. And everything else is a dangerous distraction. Whether it's carbon capture and sequestration or nuclear power or geoengineering, these are magical ideas that can't actually deal with the problem. And I just want to say that it used to be like a decade ago when people talked about climate justice, it was this idea that there are solutions that are good for the planet and good for people. We can have, we can address both problems at the same time. We can have climate solutions that help address justice issues. And climate justice, now we understand climate justice is not a win-win. It is actually the only way to win. It is the injustice that has created the crisis. The climate crisis is just the emergent consequence of a whole different problem, which is the exploitation of communities all over the planet at once. And the emergent consequence of that has been is planetary destabilization. And so for me, like, yes, there's urgency, which means there's no time for shortcuts and no time for time or energy to be wasted on false solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And Martha, I wanted to ask you to kind of go a little bit more into what Gopal is referring to as false solutions at a local and state level. What are these false climate solutions that we should prepare to fight against?
We helped create the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office in the city of LA, and we couldn't get rid of that framing. And it wasn't our framing, but the environmental justice community had to step in and sort of take that and make that department our own. We couldn't get rid of that, right? Because what we heard in the meetings of the groups that wanted to work on this climate emergency was, you got to draw down carbon. We've got to go to negative carbon emissions. How do you get to net zero? And I'm thinking, carbon is the co-pollutant, not the other way around, right? And so if you focus just on carbon, you actually don't solve the problem, like Gopal had said. But what was sort of incredibly troubling is that nobody was bothered by solutions that actually put burdens on poor people and people of color. Nobody was bothered by solutions that didn't help create a care-based economy. Right? No, it's carbon, right? It's horrible. We must act, we must do it, right? And so there's lots of false solutions within that, right? And one of the main ones at the local level is this idea that we can decarbonize buildings and do it justly, versus what we've said, we actually need energy democracy and governance and a seat and a real role in governance, right? So that's one of the areas where we've had to reshift the conversation, expend a lot of political capital, a lot of fights with our own I call them the frenemies, which are the big green groups who often really like the idea of tech solutions because it's popular to think we can solve this without a sacrifice. And it's sort of stunning coming from people who are not living in the sacrifice zones, right? And so that's who gets sacrificed again. So at the state level, where do I begin? I mean, California's entire climate leadership, in quotes, is based on the ultimate of false solution, right? It monetizes the sky. It monetizes pollution because there's value in carbon, right? And so you can create a carbon market and cap and trade. And then we were told, but don't worry, we'll give you the money, right? We'll give you some of that money. That's the justice solution. Well, when you build on top of inequality, you deepen inequality. You actually don't dismantle it. And so everything from the carbon offsets, which, you know, is like, Denise, will you diet for me because I don't feel like it? So you can offset my calories. It's ridiculous. And then there are these tech solutions like carbon capture and sequestration, low carbon fuels, right? And they've been talking about them for 10 years, and they could be solutions, but not if you want to achieve climate justice, right? And shift the economy. And so you have public agencies acting in the behest of capital, not at the behest of public. So there will be, you know, we just submitted a letter to the California Air Resources Board against carbon capture and sequestration. We were just stunned to see the relationship between the people promoting it and venture capitalists, the oil industry, and funding of the institutions who are producing the research that say this is viable. And it takes a special kind of evil, which reminds me of the special kind of evil that envisioned the bomb in the first place, to think you can suck up carbon from a refinery, engineer it so you leave the air pollution, but take the carbon, which has value, that then you can re-inject to get more oil, right? So there's an evil to that logic, right? Because you've just made air pollution worse for the workers at the refinery and the communities that live there. So that's what, but at the national level, there's, you know, pick your poison in terms of false solutions that are currently in the infrastructure plan, and even in the plans that said, you know, 40% of that money had to be the Justice 40. Well, not if you have all of the above energy plan, which is what today, you know, Gina McCarthy was saying, because, you know, this is my pitch to you, Denise. What does all of the above mean? You know, it means carbon capture and sequestration, oil offsets, geoengineering, bioenergy, incineration of trash, landfill gas, liquefied natural gas, clean hydrogen, and clean coal. And I'm going to pass it to Denise to talk about that other false solution deeply embedded in our infrastructure program.
You must be talking about the 50 billion in subsidies for aging nuclear reactors. This is a false solution, and it's a false solution that is connected to other false solutions. Why is nuclear power a false solution for climate change? It is too dirty, it is too dangerous, it is too expensive, it is too slow. And each one of these things has a direct, from a physicians organization in particular, a direct impact on health. Cost, it's not cost effective. It takes a long time for these plants to become operational. And then of course, if they end up, they need decommissioned at some point, very, very, very expensive. But the one that gets me the most is that it is somehow clean. Nuclear power cannot be clean when it produces 2,000, each reactor produces 2,000 tons of highly radioactive spent fuel every year, which adds to the 90,000 tons that we already have. And there is no safe storage solution, no credible safe storage solution. This has led to another false solution, which I hope everybody will get involved in this fight, which is this desire to create centralized interim storage facilities for nuclear waste. And this would involve taking very dangerous radioactive waste from around the country, putting it on what is now a crumbling infrastructure, without consent for any communities where the trains will be passing, and dumping it on. There's no consent for the sites that they're looking at either right now, particularly in the New Mexico-Texas border area. And so that is one problem, is it has a bad solution that is now there are now entities trying to create yet another false solution with the centralized interim storage. Also, the idea that it would be interim means that it would have to be moved again. And that's likely not going to happen. So those would become permanent waste sites. Is it safe? No, that's another false solution. And particularly when we talk about the impacts of climate on nuclear power. Nuclear power is a water hog. What happens when there's droughts? When we have earthquakes, they're also not set up for that, and that is also connected to climate. In addition, storms and fires. We had the Woolsey fire began on the Santa Susana Field Lab property, which is where we had the first nuclear meltdown that is the first and worst in the country, is still not cleaned up. And when that vegetation, when that soil catches on fire, it creates more public exposure to radiation and to the chemical contaminants there. And the other thing that's really important to say, I think, with nuclear in particular, is that radionuclides are the most toxic substances on Earth. They remain toxic for a very long time. In the case of some common ones, cesium-137 and strontium-90, we're talking hundreds of years, centuries. With plutonium, we're talking 24,000 year half-life, which when you multiply it by 10 to 12 is at 500,000 years, far longer than we've existed as a civilization, is how long this material becomes toxic for. It is toxic. So, and I think the worst thing about false solutions such as this one is that they prevent real solutions. Our allies at NIRS, the Nuclear Information Resource Service, have calculated that the $50 billion in this new national nuclear bailout would prevent the creation of 60,000 new jobs in renewable energy, efficiency, and other clean energy infrastructures. So those are just some of the reasons why nuclear power is a false solution for climate change, but also a false solution for energy.
I would just build on that really quick with one thing that I was just thinking about as you were speaking, Denise, which is, if you care about the climate, or if you're a person who's like concerned about climate change, and you think to yourself, well, we have to do something, this sort of the politics of desperation, I think it's worth interrogating what we are actually desperate about. Because the thing that makes something like nuclear or carbon capture and sequestration or any of these false solutions appealing is not because we are desperate about the climate crisis. It is because we are desperate about maintaining business as usual in the way that we live and run an economy. And so the idea of nuclear power is a great solution if what you want to do is continue maintaining the concentration of wealth and resources and power and inequity in our society until everything collapses. But if you're actually interested in figuring out how we as peoples together navigate to a different and better way of being as we deal with the inevitable consequences of what's happened, then it's a terrible idea, because it doesn't help us do that. And so what it reveals is what we're actually desperate about. Are we actually desperately trying to maintain what we've got? Or are we actually open to seeing a different way of being in the world? Which, those solutions are here all the time. Every time you bring up the problem of like nuclear waste, they say, well, that's a problem we have to solve, but as soon as we solve that, it'll be okay. It's like, well, we have solutions that work. Community owned and controlled clean energy works, actually. We know it works. We've been doing, there's all kinds of things we know it works. Peasant agriculture feeds the world. We know it works. Indigenous sovereignty protects biodiversity. We know it works. So it's not like we don't have the answers. They just require us to live a different way. And that's what people are desperate about.
Yeah, that was a really great way to wrap that up, Gopal and Denise. I want to talk a little bit about breaking down silos. I know it's really important at our work at PSR-LA, as Martha phrases, to build the connective tissues that weave all of our work in different program areas, whether it be from nuclear threats and energy to oil drilling, land use, and air quality. Building it all together is really important in our work. So I want to start with Martha, but I want to open it up to you all as well. How does this idea of breaking silos all around help us achieve our goal to a safer and healthier world for everyone?
Well, I think as we started to break down those silos as an organization, it was actually a deep part of the transformation of PSR, right? If you think of PSR Los Angeles in relationship to what it was traditionally seen as and what it is now, it is because we busted those silos and we realized we have to be about justice. We have to center justice. And sometimes we know what that means. And sometimes we know, okay, it's about who you're working with, because that's how you build power. And I think as we broke those down internally, we struggled, and then we're like, wait, well, it's it's the management of homes. So when I heard Gopal talk about what the economy is, I'm like, well, that's what we're doing. We're trying to infuse this concept of social responsibility, of preventing what you can't cure, and of the fundamental idea of first do no harm, right? That's what we're trying to do. And all of our work from, when we started working on the precautionary principle, when we, really fought in California, every time we mentioned it, industry would lose their minds, and then people stopped talking about it. But we still need that. We still need a different, a way to assess alternatives, a way to understand what does it mean to have ecologically based solutions. And, it's meant we've changed, it's transformed us, right? The first time I went to a movement generation retreat, I was like, this doesn't work in cities. This only works if you have land out there somewhere, because that's my background, right? I am an urban girl, and we had little skinny trees and no parks growing up in LA. And so it is about sort of seeing what's possible, and then saying, no, well, we actually need more than that, right? So now we're focusing on governance, because we don't break the silos unless you change how this is governed. If you think of the history of public administration and government administration, it was all about creating silos to manage people, right? They use military structures to structure how our government should run in a democracy, right? So we actually created institutional forces that are shut off to us, right? So the CIMO is about creating a commission and a place of governance and a due relationship with the city. The fights we're having at the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee are all about, no, you do not get to decide, announce, and defend. And as Paulina Torres said, we want to be involved from inception to implementation. And it, Gopal is always about, if you're not ready to govern, you're not ready to win. And as a Nicaraguan who spent time with the Sandinista revolution, it is really, really true, right? You will fail if you don't have that holistic view and the sets of relationships where, I don't know this, but you know what? Like on the building decarbonization work, we changed the name of it, and we began to center on tenants' rights groups, right? How would you do this? How would you do this so that, one, the clean air benefits come to poor people, but not at the expense of their housing? And that unsiloed thinking allows us to see that the multiplicity of effects and things that you have to change. That's not exactly how I wanted to say, but it works.
Yeah, and Denise and Gopal, if you have thoughts, please feel free to jump in as well.
I'll just say really briefly that for me, like I said, I'm not a big fan of climate as a frame, but one of the things that it has offered us is the ability to actually interrogate the systemic problem. We have a way of talking about the system scales problems that have really opened up the possibility for people to think more holistically and, in more well-rounded ways. And we first put together the Just Transition Framework. Part of what we wanted people to understand is extractivism is not just oil and mining, right? A Walmart is extractive. It's designed to take more wealth out of the community than it puts in. A payday lending is extractive, and it degrades and it compromises our relationships and our capacity to care for each other. That militarism isn't just armies, it's also policing and prisons, and that the solutions have to actually be, that we have to actually be practicing that self-governance. So for us, transformative justice and learning to self-govern our way through harm and hurting is a really important part of addressing the climate crisis. Like the resilience of our communities is not simply going to be in the ability to grow food, because when push comes to shove, we'll figure out how to do that. It's going to be how we navigate harm and hurting together. It's going to be how we self-govern our work together. It's going to be about how we make the really hard decisions together, and we should be practicing that. So for me, I think one of the opportunities that we have is this kind of opportunity to engage with the complexity of how all of the issues are connected. And we are seeing that so much more in our movements. I think, and I think that's one of the gifts of Black Lives Matter. It's one of the gifts of queer movements and the embracing of complexity and of diversity, radical, deep embrace of diversity. And those have given us new ways of thinking as a social movement that are about actually connecting all of the issues. And I think there, in the same way that the pandemic, we hear the term syndemic now a lot, which is it's not just a pandemic affecting all people, but there's compounded conditions that are building on top of each other. And I think that's really important. The fact that folks in healthcare came out and said, gun violence is a public health issue, is an attempt to disrupt and disturb those silos. And so I think there's been a lot of progress in our movements around that, because we can start to see that these are all manifestations of a common, a social, economic, and cultural order, and that we're trying to, and the one thing when you said, Martha, it's like we spend all our time fighting against what we don't want. That's really at the heart of the Just Transition framework for us. It's like, if all we do is fight against what we don't want, we will learn to love the fight. And we'll have nothing left for our vision but longing, and longing isn't good enough. You have to actually live into the world you want. You have to create it. And then you have to defend it. And that, creating new ways of being, new economy, new management of home, new culture, that's the way we do that. And we can't do that issue by issue. We have to do that by community. We have to do that at a whole different understanding of scale. And so that to me is part of the whole, the truly liberating potential of getting out of our issue silos. And part of that is, what you're doing, Denise, is getting people to see that there's a relationship between militarism, dirty energy, all of these things are connected and deeply rooted, and that we can't tolerate anything that treats people and places disposable. I think that's another way of seeing those connections.
Yeah. So Denise, I want to ask you, how do we center, kind of going off of what Gopal just said, how do we center community health and safety in respect to the nuclear threats and issues that you're working on to address this at a local and national level?
Well, we have just begun in the last 2 years to have some experience doing that. But first, I just want to say why community health and safety must be the framework for nuclear weapons abolition. Nuclear weapons are a local issue. If you talk to the Trinity downwinders and tell them nuclear weapons are a national issue, they're going to go, no. If you talk to people living near Hanford or the Savannah River, where the Cold War legacy waste is threatening vital ecosystems and they're having cancers in their communities, they're going to say, no, nuclear weapons are a local issue. They're not a national issue. But it's more than that. It's because that is where we can center the voices of frontline communities. And I'm talking about, the folks who live near weapons production or waste sites. I'm talking about downwinders. I'm also talking about atomic veterans, where there's a real, it's not a theoretical issue anymore. Now it's real, it's authentic, it's your neighbor. It's also now, maybe, some of those harms happened in the past, but the impacts are happening now. It brings it more into a here and now issue. And of course, it's not just, we have a real threat today. We have the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock. Doomsday Clock is 100 seconds before midnight, the closest it's ever been. That's taking both climate and nuclear weapons into account. But rather than let that engender panic, although I have to say it's a little funny, because when we talk about panic and desperation, part of me wishes there was a little bit more panic and desperation about nuclear weapons, because it is so out of sight, out of mind, and whereas climate is not. So we have this campaign that we're working on called Back from the Brink. And it really is about bringing local communities together throughout the country and taking this issue to their city councils, to county boards, to state legislators, and saying, in a form of a resolution is basically the most concise argument you can have. You can take these very lofty papers. We have studies, especially in the health field, all studies, but you basically have your this, therefore that, in the most, it's something that an elected official can wrap their mind around. And we're finding a much greater reception than we have when we talk on the federal level. We've had local officials say, well, this is a no-brainer. And it's very encouraging to those of us who are used to sitting in front of seeing sort of rather stony, faces in Congress. So, and it's also allowing the opportunity for there to be more intersectional conversations, so that when you're pulling together the people in your community, you're not just doing peace activists, you're going to reach out to the environmental justice community, you're going to reach out to the racial justice community, you'll reach out to labor, you can reach out to the faith community, which has been extraordinarily powerful in this fight. And so, and we have, city officials who we're making progress. We're having a different experience, and all of this is information that we can take up to the decision makers and say, hey, you know what? These groups, these organizations in your district, these cities in your district want you to take action on this. So it's got this advocacy path, but it also has this great benefit of public awareness and of bringing diverse communities together. That's the idea. And again, we're having some success. We have 50 cities that have adopted resolutions, Los Angeles and the state of California among them, many more to go. But I think those local elected officials also understand that this is about community health and safety as much as many of the other things that they usually work on a daily basis, including potholes. So we're making some inroads there.
Thank you, Denise. Gopal, I heard you use the word climate pandemic recently on a podcast, and I really liked it. So I'm just going to use that phrase. We're now experiencing the climate pandemic, the COVID crisis, and the nuclear crisis. And health professionals have been expressing their concern and warning us about all three for decades. And we're already feeling two of those things, the COVID and the climate crisis, and we're at the final hour of the nuclear crisis. So Denise, I want to pose this question to you as well. What role do health professionals have in sounding that alarm before it's too late? I know you touched on this a little bit just now with the Back from the Brink campaign, but.
Well, physician and health professional advocacy is the core of our organization from day one. That was in our DNA, where physicians realize we have to step outside of our clinical roles. If our goal is to do preventative medicine to prevent what we cannot cure, and in this case, a nuclear war, we have to get involved in advocacy. And so, but what I think what's happening now and what's been happening now with our organization is that credible voice of the physician is paired with the lived experience of community members. And that together can be a very powerful tool for change. When one of our physicians talks about, in the instance of nuclear weapons, how even a small detonation could require up to 10,000 burn beds. And we only have 1,500 in the country, and most of them are used. That gets tension. So we have plenty of doctors that have physicians and scientists that have been sounding the alarm on pandemics for a long time, and their voices weren't listened to. Same thing with climate. And it really it's not the same thing with nuclear weapons. So that credible, authoritative voice that directly, particularly when it's paired with frontline communities, I think we've seen that be an effective tool for change, and we just need to keep building upon it.
I referenced the climate pandemic phrase. Gopal, do you want to kind of go a little bit deeper into that for the audience?
Sure. The word, pandemic literally just means all people, right? Pandemos. And it's a interesting way of understanding what's happening, of course. And you only get this kind of a pandemic through a kind of globalized economy in which this can happen. But there's other kinds of pandemics that have been happening. And it's what's interesting is the demos part, the like all people or all persons, that's a really political idea. What does it mean to be a person? Who gets to have personhood, right? That is a shifting political question and always has been. There are, it's like we assume to take for granted who is a person, but personhood is afforded unequally and unfairly, and has been over time through enslavement, through suffrage, through repression of suffrage, all these different things, through gender inequality. There's many, many ways in which personhood is adjudicated. And in fact, rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth help us think about personhood in a different way, right? Like, we don't think of sudden oak death as a pandemic, but they do, but it is if you think of the oak as kin. And so I think there is something important about us. I don't want to just make a metaphor of the pandemic that we are in. It is obviously a very serious emergent consequence of degrading living systems, and it is a powerful reflection of the imbalance in our relationships as a function of the economy. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that there are many, many things compounding upon each other, interacting with each other, that create the syndemic of these compounded forces, and they will, unless we intervene, reproduce inequality, or they will travel the well-worn paths of inequality. And it is, as Denise points out, it is, it's like, well, we'll find a safe way to store it. Well, the interim solution has been indigenous people's lands, poor people's lands. That this is the way the system will distribute. This is the way personhood is truly manifested in this economy. Who has actual access to rights and who does not. So I think that for me, that's like, when I'm using the term in that way, I'm trying to get us to like think a little bit differently about that notion of what is it, who are all the people, and what does it mean, what else is out there that's affecting all people. And there's at the start of the pandemic, and I think this is really, it's like, and this is the thing about nuclear, the threat of nuclear war and climate. It's like, we're constantly, we find ourselves comparing. It's like we're comparing the threat of nuclear war to the climate crisis. We're comparing the pandemic to the climate crisis. We're comparing we're comparing COVID to car crashes. And it's like, what kills more people? It's like, we shouldn't be comparing them. We should be connecting them. Like, they are all manifestations of a common cause, which is an economy hell bent on the exploitation of land and labor for the accumulation of wealth. And it sounds trite to say that, but none of us think that's a good idea. Why aren't we living into a different way of being? And that pollutes the way we even approach healthcare, right? So we find ourselves adjudicating who gets access and who doesn't, right? And I always point out that if you believe in universal healthcare, then what you imagine healthcare is has to change. Because the nature of healthcare in our society today is the net transfer of life expectancy from poor people in the global south to rich people in the global north, and poor people in the zip code over, poor Black folks in the zip code over to rich white folks in the neighboring zip code. That's how healthcare is manifested. So we have to take a justice approach if we believe in universal healthcare, if we believe in do no harm, if we believe in precaution, if we believe in free, prior, and informed consent. Sorry, I think I went off the rails there a little bit.
Oh no, we were on that train. We were on that justice train with you.
Yes, we were.
And we did some work with Naomi Klein around this idea of the care-based economy. And what does that look like? And I know that for us, it just captured our imagination, right? Including what you said, right? Healthcare is not health. Healthcare is not wellness, right? And so what are the things that we need to do? And for us, it was like, okay, addressing things like saying like carbon is the co-pollutant. So then what do you do on the ground, right? You fight against air pollution. You fight against the collusion between government and polluting industries that actually calculate the risk for you, right? Without informed prior consent, they tell you this is how much risk we decided that you should bear for us to have this thing over here that you also don't benefit from. So that care-based economy is about, not a living wage, but a wage that allows people to thrive. Because remember, wage, is profit, and it's taken from the value of labor, right? So I do remember my college marches, but that how do you change that? That's something. It's incredibly daunting, and it does force us sometimes to work a silo at a time. But what we've done is begin to change the story and the narrative and how we talk about the work within the different spaces, right? And we're starting to create some understanding of that, but certainly we need lots more power to do that. And I did want to say, so one of my anxieties as we work on this and this we need any solution is that often both scientists and health professionals who see themselves as scientists will get caught up in the boys and toys, right? And they may oppose nuclear, but maybe nuclear power might not be as bad as nuclear weapons. So we should be reasonable and examine both those sides. Well, it'd be great if I had a shop vac that could pull out carbon out of the air. Let's explore that as a thought experiment and figure out technology to do that, right? So there's both how we are trained, is how health we are trained in that scientific method that leaves us vulnerable to those kind of solutions. So, we want to really think about how to talk to other health professionals and how to frame that issue so we don't fall into that trap. I would love it if there were a pill I could take that would, make my hair stop turning gray, but that's not going to happen, right? But maybe in 10 years, okay, right? So it's not a good analogy, but that's what we've been saying, right? Maybe in 10 years, carbon capture and sequestration will be there. Maybe in 10 years, we'll know how to do biofuels so that they actually don't pollute at the source of production and take indigenous land and other people's land, right? But that's not good enough for the moment we're in, right? The moment we're in, we need to use the practices that we know work, right? So with the fires, we have not listened to indigenous communities about forest management, and here we are, right? We have not listened to people about water, and here we are in Los Angeles where we've contaminated our groundwater because we just thought it was okay because, we'll take the water from somewhere, right? So it's a lot to dismantle, but it's, but I also see the hope, right? I see that it gets easier to have the conversation, and that there's just growing number of folks who are like, yeah, we're with you on this.
Denise, I'm always shocked that we're still actually talking about nuclear power as legitimate. It's like, the Fukushima disaster that happened, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State during the disaster, she said, nobody could have seen this coming. And it's like, really? Nobody could have seen this coming? Like, tsunami is a Japanese word that means harbor wave. Actually, you mentioned Naomi Klein mentioned that to me. I was like, oh, wow. Tsunami is a Japanese word that means harbor wave. There are these 600-year-old obelisks that they built along the coast to tell you where not to go past. And the nuclear power plant's on the wrong side of that. It's the western edge of the ring of fire, right? It's like, I think it was David Brower said a nuclear power plant is a really, really expensive way to find a fault line. And it's like, there's nothing about it that actually makes any sense at all, unless you are just myopically concerned with a narrow counting of carbon emissions that don't even consider life cycle impacts, hydrological disturbance, sea level, like just on and on. You can go on and on and on and on. And still, there's just so much money to be made on technologies that aren't real and shouldn't work. You know, it's like, it's not, it's shocking to me that it's still, the industry is so powerful that they still get to have their
and that they've got some environmentalists, you know, singing, doing their dirty work for them. Unfortunately, I have a colleague who likes to talk about how after a 3 Mile Island, the Soviet scientists said there'll never be another 3 Mile Island, and there wasn't. There was a Chernobyl, and then all the scientists, there'll never be another Chernobyl. There wasn't. There was a Fukushima, and that's going to be the next case too. As if we truly are just living for today. And I think that's part of the issue, is what we are doing and taking from future generations, should we survive to have them. Those generations, they aren't here. They can't weigh in with NRC or DOE. The decisions we're making are not just, it's far into the future, and it says a lot about who we are as a species to prioritize this short term, what we get for today. And in essence, be telling you, in many cases, their own children or their own grandchildren don't care about you. So, you know, and I also did want to add, in terms of solutions in California, that another thing that was in the NEAR's report was that I didn't know, was that 3 years after the San Onofre nuclear generating station went offline, new solar power in California exceeded what Songs had produced. So they try to scare us too, you know, away from, oh, well, we don't do this. Well, we absolutely need it as part of this recipe for power. But if one solution is introducing or bringing more problems that will then have more bad solutions, it's just got to stop somewhere.
Yeah. And all that centralized infrastructure is incredibly vulnerable to the threats of climate disruption that are caused by that very infrastructure, whether it's the coal-fired or gas-fired power plants and all the transmission lines that are running across our forests that are not being, you know, it's like we could decentralize, put communities in control, and democratically govern our energy. And it would deal with both the resilience question around how we're going to navigate the changes that are inevitable in a more equitable, fair way, so that we actually experience them together fairly, and mitigate these massive, centralized, incredibly ecologically devastating, power generating systems. So it's like, it's both builds our resilience, teaches us how to self-govern, and mitigates the causes of the climate crisis and slows down future consequences. But no, they want to fund nuclear. And you brought up the Department of Energy, and I think, a lot of people think the Department of Energy is the Department of Nuclear Weapons. It's, it's like you can speak to that much more, but I think in terms of, if you're looking at like oppositional,
don't get me started on the Department of Energy.
oppositional targets at the national level, I think Department of Energy and DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research folks, who basically have a black box budget to come up with all kinds of ridiculous schemes and spend so much money on technology that's designed to, for weapons and to maintain existing power.
And it provides an opportunity on the plus side to break out of our silos, to have climate activists looking at DOE, looking at the full of the DOE, and recognizing that nuclear weapons are an environmental justice issue, and the reverse. Nuclear abolition people have to break out of the silo and have to reach out to other communities in a much more holistic way. Otherwise, DOE can, what one group of people doesn't see makes that group of people smaller. I'm not saying this very well, But if we are able to somehow break out of our silos and just thinking of that particular agency, we could get somewhere further, I think, in terms of reform that affects both our energy and our and this plague of nuclear weapons, two existential threats in one agency.
I was thinking of another thing that you said, Denise, that was resonating with me, just about the desperation piece also, and just, but also the thing of there's this way in which, for decades, we talked about the climate crisis as if it was coming, and so then there's just all kinds of muscle memory around the idea that it's in the future. And we're living through this incredible wildfires and droughts and catastrophes all over the planet. And we're losing, and people are still saying, oh my God, it's going to get so bad. It's like, what part of this is not bad, and the reality is, for communities who have been on the front lines of the crisis, it was bad from the beginning. It's like, we talk a lot about tipping points in climate. And so this relates to the nuclear, because nuclear is the threat of nuclear war is always talked about. Well, first of all, it's talked about as if nobody would be dumb enough to do it, but we were dumb enough to make it. So clearly somebody's dumb enough to do it, and we've done it. So we know we're dumb enough to do it. But it's always talked about as like in the future, even though if it ever it's the end of the future if it happens. So it's got a very similar kind of thing of being put off in our consciousness in the way climate was. But if you center, as you keep lifting up those who are on the front lines, it changes, like the point of intervention is so much sooner. And in climate, in climate science, we talk about tipping points all the time. And if you're a planetary climate scientist exploring, looking at the planetary level, you're talking about like what percentage of the Amazon is going to burn before it becomes a tipping point and we have runaway climate change, right? But if you're indigenous people in the Amazon, the very first bulldozer to put in the very first road that takes out the very first tree to set up the very first exploratory oil well is potentially the end of your way of life. And if you were in control of those decisions, the tipping point would be a hell of a lot sooner, and we would intervene a hell of a lot earlier, because if communities actually had control over the decisions that affect their daily lives, we would see a very different outcome. But it's like we're waiting until we lose some percentage of the Amazon. Like, why indigenous sovereignty would have prevented us from getting there in the first place. And it's this, it's the same thing with the nuclear story. It's like, if you put the communities who are on the front lines, if they have the power, the right to intervene in what happens in their communities, they wouldn't allow those mega mines or those waste disposal facilities or a nuclear testing.
No, they would not. And we have to deal with our labs too, our national labs, which are actually run by private companies, and we have a very big conflict of interest there. And that is where, theoretically, labs should be where really good solutions come from. And it's, just not at all been the case. I do worry that the fact that the nuclear threat is so invisible that it just allows it to just fall away to the same old core group of people that have been doing it for decades. And yet we have a messaging issue, because telling people that we're 100 seconds to midnight kind of induces a bit of paralysis. And we have had many, 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 many near misses before in our history. So we've been lucky, and luck isn't going to last forever. And so I think the more that we break out of our silos and we work on what we want, stopping the bad, yes, but thinking more about what we want together, that can take some of the sting out of the panic or the shutdown that happens, fear, and also help us move forward in love. And that is that feels like a much more of a journey that I'd like to be on than this,
Yeah, so as we're getting ready to wrap up this discussion, last question for you all. what can health professionals and allies do right now to advance the movement towards a just transition? And also, if you have any final thoughts to wrap up as well.
They should call Rahel.
Or help join PSR. Everybody who's on here who knows a health professional, get them to join. And I think, that's one. And I think, the experience that we just had doing the comment letter to the California Air Resources Board, and I think Marjane is one of the doctors who's on the call, having her as part of our sort of thinking through the letter and the outreach was really, it's just a really wonderful experience, because then you realize, why you're at the organization, because the physicians that are part of our organization have this vision that they share with us. And so I think for us as we've grown as an organization, making more space, because to engage our physicians so that they are actually speaking to this, and then I have lots of ideas about shifting narrative and how to tell a different story, and how doctors could be those messengers. And then, the power of seeing physicians actually standing with impacted communities. That's different. And I don't think anyone else has that, right? That where we're doing that together. And now I think as we fine tune that we are the health voice for a new economy. I think, we're having lots of conversations internally with our board and our allies about what does that work look like moving forward. And then I'll hand it over to Denise, but I think, yeah.
I am serious when I tell health professionals to call Rahel, or Rahel is our membership coordinator, and we have a program, the Health Ambassador Program, and it travels, especially now in the age of COVID. So we used to have, and we still will have, one-day trainings where we can do a little breakdown on the issues and let health professionals know, hey, you don't have to be an expert on these things. You don't. You talk about what you know, and we can guide you through what some of the key things are, but also skills training, how to be in a lobby meeting with elected officials, or to testify at a hearing, or to speak to media, some real skills type things too. But again, we can take these to residency programs, to any kind of basic medical association or professional association you might have. And then you will be standing next to frontline communities in almost every one of our fights. It really, really also does something for those impacted communities when they see that kind of solidarity, because a lot of them will get, oh, everybody gets cancer. You don't know what caused your cancer. You don't know what you don't know. This hysteria, and they don't feel heard and they don't feel listened to. And when they come in, they'll say like, well, everybody on my street has this. And, you can just sort of see the same when a physician then stands next and says, actually, this facility over here has these chemicals, and these chemicals are associated with these kind of exposures. And we can see this is a reasonable thing that we might see should people be exposed to this. It also buoys up the community. So, and I've seen that, firsthand in the fight to clean up the Santa Susana Field Lab. So I just wanted to put that out there. And, there's scalable ways to get involved. If you get on our list, you might just hit an action alert. You might sign a sign-on letter. You might want to come to an event or a hearing. You might want to get trained and become, and really take on one of these issues as what you do. So that's and I'll put some things in the chat about some real simple, easy lifts on the nuclear front as well.
And actually, I want to lift up two of the comments in the chat. Our partner Jasmine Vargas talked about that we get about 11% of our energy from a nuclear plant. And every time that gets brought up, they're like, well, what are we going to replace that with? And, there's the gas industry, well, with natural gas. So, that's where us talking to each other and fighting on these fronts is really important. And also, what Tom wrote, we have 2 incinerators that are burning trash to energy, and we have been providing a lot of perverse incentives to call that renewable. And so we are now trying to bring together communities that live all along the petrochemical fence line in Los Angeles, right? So we work on oil drilling. We're part of the SCAN Coalition. And then there's the refinery communities and our allies at CPE and many other communities. In Paramount, there's refineries. And then East Communities for Environmental Justice, who's working in Long Beach on one of those incinerators. And so because we can have plastics policies that say, let's get rid of straws and paper and plastic bags, at the same time that we're having other policies around the refineries. And at the oil drilling sites, some of them are actually aimed at keeping the oil in the ground and out of those, right? So we have to really begin to work at all of those places together. So Tom, I'm going to call you because let's fight on this. And we're saying zero waste, right? I love to shop, but I know that part of that is from my own history of lack and scarcity, right? And so we do have to change our culture and our practices. And that's where we find wholeness in that work versus, buying new pretty things, which is always fun, but it's what's getting us here.
I am going to say join PSR-LA because that's what you should do. I think my last comment is really just that social justice, racial justice, economic justice, it is preventative healthcare. Like the conditions that create healthy families, healthy children, healthy communities, healthy ecosystems are the conditions that are the conditions of a just society. And so health can be our guiding light, our purpose, and one of them, a really important one, but we have to step away from the idea as health is something that somebody possesses. They either are healthy or they're not healthy. They either have it or they don't. It's about them as the individual. It's that way of thinking that has made this pandemic so hard to get out of, as opposed to my health is deeply interdependent on the health and well-being of everybody around me and vice versa. And I must actually care about everyone in order to ensure true health, which is shared. And so I think that's what organizations like PSR-LA gave us the opportunity to experience, to do. And there is just something deeply, deeply transformative about getting organized. Because no matter what you do by yourself that you think is making a difference is never going to give you that sense of wholeness or that sense of agency or that sense that you will know deep down in your heart that you are not actually making the difference you want to make. But when you get together with other people and you get organized, especially in a community of practice like physicians or healthcare providers, then you have the ability to actually experience what real change can look like. And so, this is an opportunity to get organized. So you should, don't miss it because it'll bring you joy. And every doctor knows that joy is healthy.
Yeah. Thank you, Gopal. Thank you, Denise. And thank you, Martha, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure our folks who are watching this webinar also did. And thank you to our audience and everyone watching for joining our final Health and Justice webinar. This webinar was recorded and we will be sending it out to you tomorrow. As we conclude this evening, I want to reiterate and echo what everyone has said about joining PSR-LA. We have launched our summer membership drive. We are building a membership base of passionate health advocates and allies, and we invite all health professionals and students who are passionate about addressing public health issues at the root, seeking social justice alongside impacted communities by holding our representatives accountable to uphold public health priorities through policy, who are interested in learning and growing as an active participant in health policy advocacy through grassroots organizing, and who are looking to be part of a like-minded community to join PSR-LA. You can click on that link in the blue text to become a member and to learn a little bit more about what that means. And make sure that you're signed up for our email list to make sure that you're getting all of our alerts and e-blasts. I also want to announce that a big part of our membership drive this year is a new Facebook group, PSR-LA Health Voices. This Facebook group is will be a central place where PSR-LA members can discuss current events and policies related to our work in environmental health and nuclear threats, and receive updates about our program and campaigns, and where we will host live meetings. We will regularly post action alerts, educational resources, relevant reports and articles, but most importantly, that space is meant for discussion and conversation. So if you're not already on our email list, please, I encourage you to sign up as we roll out the details of joining the Facebook group so that we can keep the conversation alive. And with that being said, lastly, I just want to say thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for taking time to share your knowledge with us. And that concludes our webinar for today. Have a good night, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Serve and protect the coal mine. Serving up grenades to granny standing on the farm.